Welcome to the ThreeViewMirror podcast. I'm Rachelle.
I'm genxjono, also known as John Catrides.
And I'm Chris Clues, known as Chris Clues, also known as Chris Clues.
It's time to get started with our podcast, where each week we discuss 3 topics across 3 different decades from 3 different points of view. But this podcast is more than a listening experience, because we ask you, the listener, that you get to put on your secret decoder ring and decipher the connection between these 3 seemingly random topics that we are about to discuss. But before we go into that, let's get some general introductions from John and Chris.
As I said, my name is John Catrides. I can be found across social media platforms, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, under the moniker genxjono, where I talk about all things 70s, 80s, 90s, and generally, Gen X.
And I'm Chris Clues, a keynote speaker and author, and I talk and write about the work and life lessons that we can learn from 80s pop culture, the very best decade, in this guy's opinion, for pop culture in the history of the world.
And I'm Rachelle O'Black, better known as genxjono, across my different social media accounts, and I am your host for the 3View podcast this week. Okay, and before we jump into anything today, we have to thank our wonderful sponsor. Chris, could you tell us about our sponsor?
Yes, absolutely. 3ViewMirror podcast is brought to you by our friends at Do You Remember, a global community made up of millions of people who are passionate about nostalgia and pop culture, just like us and like you. Do You Remember inspires readers to share memories, reminisce, and step back from the fast-paced world so they can relax, smile, and feel good as a daily goal. All 3 of us are pop culture and nostalgia nerds, and Do You Remember is our destination for everything from the 50s to the 90s. Don't be a neo-Maxu-Zune dweeby. Follow or subscribe to Do You Remember today, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.
So each week, the whole premise of the show is that we take turns hosting and coming up with 3 topics of discussion. And this week, I have an incredible set of 3 things for these 2 gentlemen right here. Chris and John have no idea what I'm about to introduce as the topics, and therefore have no idea how these topics connect. You, the audience, will listen the whole time as these 2 discuss these 3 items, and they too will be just as surprised at the end of the podcast as to the connection between the 3. So, gentlemen, I ask, are you ready?
As ready as I've ever been.
Okay, so this week our 3 topics are Charlie's Angels, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and Baywatch.
I wore the right shirt.
You did. Come to think of it, that's Jeff Spicoli right there. So What made you buy that shirt, Chris?
Jeff Spicoli is one of my favorite characters of all time, and I just thought this was the greatest shirt because it's, when he has the bagel. Like, so, yeah. And I put this shirt on because, I don't know, maybe I guess I put a bug in your place and heard what you were talking about. So.
Yeah. Well, we're going to go first off to Charlie's Angels. And, if anybody out there does not know Charlie's Angels, which I doubt it, it was an iconic show from the 1970s, 1976 to 1981. And I think it was just a forefront of women in TV. They were doing, it was the first time, not the first time, maybe Chris, you could speak to this, that women were the forefront, the main characters of a cop-like show.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to think a little harder about that, but you're probably, if it wasn't the first, it was very, very close. And then of course, from Charlie's Angels, we had shows like Cagney and Lacey, that was, the same kind of, the female detectives, dominating, and then a lot of sitcoms, female dominated sitcoms as well. I think a lot of them stemmed or came off of the fact that, Charlie's Angels was such a success.
I think my earliest memory with the female driven police show was Angie Dickinson, Policewoman. I was really, really little, but I remember my parents absolutely loved that. And that was really popular. And she was like a very powerful female presence leading a cop show. And then Charlie's Angels, I think, grew off of that.
And did you watch that show as a kid? I mean, that would have been, fairly early on for you, but, we all know that Gen X was allowed to watch pretty much whatever we wanted to watch.
My parents put on the television.
Did you watch the show?
Sure. I mean, anything after a certain hour in the day when our parents were finally home, then our job was to change the channel to whatever channel they wanted to watch. Unless there was a special that was like driving up our ability to choose Wizard of Oz, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, holiday specials. For the most part, if it wasn't something like that, we watched what they watched. So yeah, I remember watching shows like Police Woman, and my parent and my mom especially loved Charlie's Angels because she liked to see what they were wearing and the hair and all that stuff.
I was going to say, I watched it, so 1976. I watched it at 6, 7, 8 years old. I was watching it because, it was on the television. By the time it was coming to an end, and I was 11-year-old boy, I was watching it for a very different reason, Charlie's Angels, of course. But, I agree with John in the sense that, the shows that I watched were the shows that were on because my parents are watching them. Typically, my dad, I remember sitting down for dinner and watching MASH and Andy Griffith because that's what my dad had on, and it was his time to watch his shows. But Charlie's Angels is definitely on my list for sure.
And what do you think what's the first character that comes to your mind of the stars of the show? Which one comes to mind first?
Farrah Fawcett.
Probably Jacqueline Smith for me.
Really? I can't get that picture of the poster. Farrah Fawcett at that time, for me and for like all my friends, she led the show just because she was iconic in so many ways. There was the poster that was on most of our walls, or for me, it was my older brother. It was her marriage to the $6 Million Man, Lee Majors. She was Farrah Fawcett Majors for all those years. And yeah, if you ask me who I thought was the prettiest, who I had a crush on as a kid, I think I was actually outside of the norm because I like Jacqueline Smith. But in terms of who I would think of first, it's Farrah.
And here's a little fun fact. And Chris, are you aware of how long Farrah Fawcett was on the show? Farrah Fawcett Majors, because at that time she billed herself as Farrah Fawcett Majors. Do you know how long she was on the show?
I don't know.
John?
I'd guess 1 season, maybe 2 at the most.
And I was sitting here doing the research for how, the connections that I wanted to make out of the show. And I was surprised, actually, because the first person that came to my mind whenever I thought of Charlie's Angels, besides the iconic poster, fingers, that's right, the finger shooting out of the black silhouette, the first person I always thought of was Farrah Fawcett. And surprisingly, she was only on the show for 1 season.
Yeah, her popularity blew up, and I think it became they couldn't afford her.
I couldn't find any reason that she had quit. There were some lawsuits that were, as a result of it, because she was under contract, obviously, but she was later replaced. Now, and I think of this show as some of the most beautiful women of the day. I mean, they were just absolutely gorgeous. Do you know who she was replaced by? I'm like a quiz show here today. Did you, John? John knows.
Yeah, Cheryl Ladd played her sister, Chris, I think.
Yes, she did. Yes, she did. She was a relative out of town that, and I don't remember truly the plot, but, and Cheryl Ladd was considered one of the most beautiful women of the day.
She had some great posters as well.
Yes.
Along with Cheryl Teagues, Cheryl Ladd, Cheryl Teagues.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because, when you talked at the beginning about Charlie's Angels and the impact that it had on female-driven shows, and again, not just the detective shows, but really, female-driven shows in general as we got into the 80s. And I liken it to, when people talk about the show The Big Bang Theory today, and I liken it to Revenge of the Nerds. The movie Revenge of the Nerds, before Revenge of the Nerds came out, we were never really rooting for the nerds. People, the heroes in the movies were the heroes that we expected. They came in on horseback or they were big and strong. And you're like, yeah, that guy could save the entire town or save the world. And suddenly the nerds were the heroes and we were rooting for them. And because of Revenge of the Nerds, Big Bang Theory exists. And I think, when they talk about like a coach, when you think about football coaches and they're always like, what's that coach's tree? What's his lineage look like? He's Bill Belichick. And then from Bill Belichick, all these coaches are now head coaches on teams. And you could look at Charlie's Angels, like from Charlie's Angels, their tree of female driven shows. And it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's, and at one point, and this was something that I didn't think about at the time. Okay. I remember watching the show. there was there was the whole evolution of the porn scares of the 1970s. 1970s was when porn really started to make its.
I'm just looking at John's face. He's like, "How is this connecting? Is this going to be the connection? Is this the fourth? Is this going to be the fourth segment?"
I just have never heard the term porn scare.
Not scared, the porn awareness, like they were starting. That's when people were starting to,
Be afraid of porn?
kind of, yeah, like in the public, in the media. And this was the days of John Holmes and 8mm films were, and all those kind of things that were making their way into society a little bit more. It was always there. I mean, nobody can deny that it was always there. Like I have a newspaper downstairs that advertises drive-in movies with actual, films like that. But with this rising awareness of that, there were people that called and specifically called out Charlie's Angels as what they called jiggle TV. And, they were criticized a whole lot because jiggle TV was all about, the jiggle. And, this was the days of that was what the show was a lot about in so many ways.
Three's Company got labeled the same thing because there wasn't an episode where Chrissy wouldn't jump up and down excited about something.
Yeah. Yeah. You also, I think, everybody look, negative sells, and, people try to find the most negative headline because that's, even today, we call it clickbait today. But back then it was, about, a negative headline is going to make people pay attention. They're going to want to read it. But if you really look at Charlie's Angels and you look at the positives in it, I mean, they were the heroes of the show. Yes, were they pretty? Yeah, they were pretty, but I mean, is that a crime? It's like, so I think, right. So I think, sometimes you have to take it with a grain of salt. Like, who was the person that actually was pushing that idea that this was a negative stereotype, when in fact, if you really look at the show itself and the positive things they did, they were the heroes. They solved the cases. They were badasses. They took down guys as detectives. They were taking out guys that were supposedly stronger, air quote stronger, and they were taking them down. And so I think sometimes we have to look at who the person was that was actually writing those negative headlines that we call clickbait today.
Yeah, it was there was an executive at one of the major studios that had labeled things like Three's Company and Charlie's Angels as this jiggle TV. And I have a little quote from Farrah Fawcett where she said, in TV Guide, she says, when the show was number 3, I figured it was our acting. And when it got to be number 1, I decided it could only be because none of us wears a bra. And so, at the time, they sort of recognized this idea that, and you can look at it both ways. It was both empowering, and at the time, because of that rise in, awareness of the amount of pornography that was being put out into a larger market at that time, people were making parallels between them.
Well, the other thing is, I think they leaned into it a little bit too. This was an Aaron Spelling production, correct?
It was.
He absolutely leaned into it. If you look at, I remember that there were storylines at the time. There was one specifically where I think it was Jacqueline Smith had to infiltrate a prison. So she went in as a prisoner, and there was a shower scene where they had to take Jacqueline Smith in, and she disrobed, and none of it was essential to the plot. It was just an opportunity to get her out of her clothes. And there were a few plot lines that did that. And I think the 70s and early 80s leaned into it and just used whatever they could to get eyes on the screen.
Yeah, and there was no doubt that it sold. I mean, it became an international sensation, for multitude of reasons. It won Golden Globes, or nominated at least. It was definitely an international sensation.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, they leaned into it, because I'm still trying to figure out what Heather Thomas's role was in The Fall Guy. But yeah, it's true that was happening. But I also think that there's, when you go back and you look at the history of television, particularly the 70s and the 80s, and a lot of them were trying to push the envelope, whether it be sex, violence, language. I mean, if you got a few years after Charlie's Angels, came Hill Street Blues.
Mhm.
And I remember Hill Street Blues and was it NYPD something? Anyway, Hill Street Blues was one that they started, using curse words on television, and people thought, oh my God. And then I think they showed like one of the main characters, the guy, they showed him undressing.
NYPD Blue did that. Jimmy Smith's backside was featured.
Okay.
Ricky Schroeder from Silver Spoons got undressed on it. I think even Zach Morris, what's his real name? All of them. But what's funny is at that point, it was the men. It was the men that were sexualized, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I think they were. I mean, I don't know. I think, like I said, I think everybody tries to push the envelope in their own way during a certain, point in culture. And, we can look back and say what maybe was good and what wasn't. But I always try to look at the positive, and I try to look at like, what was it that came out of there that was positive? And I think to your point, you look at the 80s, there were so many female driven shows in the 80s, not just, again, detective ones, but sitcoms, a lot of sitcoms and movies, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at, 9 to 5 and Working Girl and some of these movies that were, that led into movies like Thelma and Louise, of course. But Charlie's Angels, in a lot of ways, kind of helped to set the tone to be able to do that. And maybe they looked at what was good in Charlie's Angels and looked at the stuff they didn't like and said, we're just going to take that stuff. We're going to put that stuff over here, but we're going to use the part we did like. And we're going to, do 9 to 5 or Working Girl or a number of other shows and movies.
Incredible movies, by the way.
What I love about that, Chris, is that you're absolutely 1,000% correct, but they also stayed true to the era. So if you look at Charlie's Angels, Charlie took them away from a life of being what they called back then meter maids and police telephone operators. So they started in traditional female unempowered roles and rose above it. 9 to 5, they started as secretaries who were demeaned and hit on. So what I love about the 70s and the early 80s is it starts with the women in these, for the time, traditional, less empowered roles, and the story arc takes them through releasing from there and becoming empowered through the storyline. And I think that's really cool because it didn't make them something that they weren't in the beginning. They started where everybody imagined women would be then, and they rose above it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
That makes absolutely perfect sense. And and I think about, Farrah Fawcett's famous poster. I mean, that is still like the record. Not a lot of people do posters anymore, I don't think as much. But that's still the record-breaking, he's got the Goonies posters in the back. That's still the record-breaking poster of a woman. Like, it's one of the most iconic images out there of a woman being beautiful, basically. And I thought that was, that also is very empowering.
Yeah, I mean, if you looked at my 16-year-old bedroom walls, they were covered with all the posters that you would think, the Farrah Fawcett's, the Samantha Fox, the Cheryl Teagues, all of those. And then the rest of it was all like these surfing cutouts that I had out of Surfer magazine. It was like this incredible mix. I don't know, maybe kids still do that, but you're right. The posters are probably, I don't know that people are still doing those, but that was a thing. That was a big thing.
And nobody really does that as much, as far as I understand. I mean, my boys had, they don't ask me for a poster, and I'm not even sure at this point that, I would let them. It's like our parents never walked into our rooms when we were kids.
My mother never let me put posters up. That's what I was going to say. She owned the walls in my room. I was allowed to put a poster on the back side of my door. So when I walked in, the back side of my door, that was what my mom allowed. Or I could hang one into the closet where it couldn't be seen. But otherwise, I didn't own the walls in my bedroom. My mother did.
And who was your one poster then, John?
I had the Farrah Fawcett poster.
See? Yeah.
He had the two Corey's poster. Corey Haim and Corey Feldman.
It was Bette Midler. Let's be honest.
Wind beneath their wings.
That was Wind beneath my wings. Well, the first time.
First today.
Yeah.
All right, so gentlemen, we've covered the posters and your boys' rooms, and girls didn't have those. We had our rock bands, and we had our idols. But we're going to move on now from Charlie's Angels, and we're going to talk a little bit about Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which we gave a kind of a hint at the beginning with good old Jeff Spicoli there. And tell me a little bit about what you remember about this. And it's a cult phenomenon and a pop culture icon, this movie. So
I'll start because it is one of my favorite movies of all time. And I think it's just an iconic coming of age movie. It was really one of those movies that kind of set the tone for the coming of age movies that came after it. They really just did a great job of blending the fun and the humor and the ridiculousness of being in high school and they tackled some important like social issues as well. And they did it in a really interesting way. And of course it launched careers like Forrest Whitaker. I mean, some people don't realize Forrest Whitaker had a role in Fast Times. And of course he went on to win an Academy Award. Sean Penn, Phoebe Cates, one of my favorites, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Judge Reinhold. So a whole host of characters. And I just absolutely love it. Great soundtrack. I could go on and on about what I love about Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
And speaking of Forrest Whitaker, the Fast Times at Ridgemont High was the very first time, it was the screen debut for Nick Cage.
Yeah.
Nick Cage, who was Francis Ford Coppola's nephew?
Nicholas Coppola is his credit. Yeah.
Yes, and he was billed in that movie. It's the only time he was ever. He didn't have a speaking role. He was billed as Nicholas Coppola.
Yeah, he was 17, so they had to do the child labor laws. And Eric Stoltz as well was in. So yeah, Fast Times. There's so much greatness in that movie for me from beginning to end. I just and the fact that it came out in 1982.
Yes.
Yeah, 82. And my friends and I bought tickets to E.T. and we snuck into Fast Times. Best decision we ever made of our lives at 12 years old.
And nobody really cared. You know what? All the people at the movie theater are probably like, yeah, they're sneaking in over there. And they didn't even care.
Yeah.
I've actually never seen it all the way through. I've seen pieces of it. I've seen the Phoebe Cates scene. I've seen the smelling the ditto paper scene. But I've never seen the movie beginning to end. Probably 80% of it I've never laid eyes on.
Shame. You get that shame meme where they're walking
it's
through
just,
going, shame.
I don't know.
You have a homework assignment out of this podcast, John.
I don't know. It's one of those things like you get to a certain point in your life. I'm like, it's gone this long without seeing it. I'm good.
Yeah. Now, see, I've never seen The Princess Bride. Never once in my life. I've only laid eyes on, what is it, Montoya, whatever his name is in the movie. I don't even know because I've never seen the movie. And people are always like, I hand in my Gen X card like right there,
Yeah, I mean, it just never drew me. Like I said, there's certain scenes that became iconic in it. Phoebe Cates, again, coming out of the pool. Maybe that's why I never saw the whole thing. I could never get past that scene. I think on the VHS tape, that's probably 3 millimeters thinner than the rest of the VHS tape. I didn't say I never rented the movie. I said I've never seen the whole thing. There is a big difference between those two statements. Do you remember how SP and EP and LP, you could tape at different speeds? And the one that commercial video was done on, if you paused it, there were all these lines. But when you were taping something, if you used the other extreme, it would be clear. So that whenever you tried to, I forget, I know where I'm going with this and I'm not going to go there. I'm just saying that commercial produced VHS movies never paused clearly.
What a shame for boys of that age in that era, right?
When I say we needed to use our imagination to fill in the blanks, I mean it literally.
Well, it was. I just, we talked, I think previously on another episode about, soundtracks, or maybe it was on The Wonderful World of Gen X on John's show, about the 80s, the soundtracks for 80s movies and how incredible they were because bands and musicians wanted to be on soundtracks. That was another revenue stream for them in a world where they didn't have a lot of them. And so, you look at the soundtrack for Fast Times and I mean, you just look at the bands that were on it. And it's incredible. It is a phenomenal soundtrack. And The Car is Moving in Stereo, of course, is the song that's in the background with Phoebe Cates. But yeah, I mean, just an incredible soundtrack.
I heard nothing during that scene. It just kind of went blank. Sound went away. Everything went away. I changed. I was going to say turning black and white. No, turning Japanese, maybe.
Oh, no.
Jeez. John just taught me what turning Japanese meant. Like, I was today years old. I was 50 years old before I understood what turning Japanese meant.
Oh, really?
I kid you not. So Phoebe Cates made John turn Japanese. So
my complete racial identity was changed momentarily.
The vapors turning Japanese.
It would cause you to go blind, right? She might have been right.
And she's been married to Kevin Kline forever.
Yeah.
Yes, she has. That I did know. I did know that.
Yeah. I was just trying to change the subject.
You always do. The only adult in the room.
No, but I did want to say, when it comes to Fast Times, do you know who wrote it?
No.
Yes.
And
I did, because I was doing my research on this, a little deeper dive than having just watched the movie. It was now his name is slipping me. Cameron Crowe. Yes. Cameron Crowe. He wrote the book by going in as an undercover student. He convinced the principal, and he spent a year going undercover to talk to all the students and find out about what went on in a high school life. And he based a lot of his characters on real people that he had encountered. And a funny connection there, which doesn't have anything to do with our connection here, but when we connect these three at the end, but one of the characters, I can't think of it at the moment, went on to write the PC for Dummy books, like in real life, and ended up being so there's a little neat little connection there.
Yeah, the Mark Ratner character.
Ratner.
The kid that we were all rooting for.
Yes.
That he was based on a student who wrote the books for dummies that started those whole books for dummies. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. So the director, did you also see who the director was? Because talking about kind of the rise of the female, right, in the early 80s.
Is it Heatherling? Did I get that?
Amy
Heckerling.
Heckerling, yes.
Yeah. And she also directed Clueless, which was the 90s Fast Times with female characters, which is a fantastic movie as well. So, and I think introduced us to Paul Rudd. I think that was one of Paul Rudd's first roles, was in Clueless. Yeah. Yeah.
She, like we find so many connections here. I mean, we have our connections at the end of this podcast, but then there are so many connections all throughout of this. It's kind of like that. Remember the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon fad that had gone on for so many years there? I think it's still a thing.
I was just going to say, a really cool thing happened for me that's connected to Fast Times, and that in my second book, I talk about lessons from Fast Times Ridgemont High. And a person that I knew, his neighbor was Judge Reinhold. And so he said, send me the book and I'll see if I can get him to sign it. Because I always said that Bradley Hamilton in Fast Times was the best big brother in movie history. I mean, what he did to help his sister and the things that he did for her, he's a great big brother. And so I put that in the book, and he actually signed it, Learn It, Live It, Know It, and sent it back to me, which, from Fast Times, is pretty cool. That was a really cool moment for me.
That is really cool. That is, I don't have anything signed by anyone. John?
No, what I was going to say, though, is, you talked about how the soundtracks were a big deal throughout the 80s. The other thing that was completely unrelated, but also a big deal, was miniseries on televisions. And there were all these miniseries events that would play nightly, and you could watch it every day of the week. And my parents were addicted to it, whether it was North and South or The Winds of War or Thornbirds or this one called Lace, which I don't think anybody remembers it, but I was so infatuated with Phoebe Cates that she actually played the principal role in this miniseries Lace, where she was trying to find out who her true mother was. And to this day, I still remember the plot line. So I may have only seen a few of the scenes in Fast Times, but I got my mother convinced that she needed to watch Lace just so that I could watch Phoebe Cates in it.
Lace sounds like something out of Shell's porn scare. We were talking about earlier.
It didn't deliver the way I thought it would, but still, I got to watch Phoebe Cates.
But truly, before, and speaking, going back, I don't know if we call it a scare, but going backwards, there was a rise in, changes in television, because in the 80s, that television and movies, we got the PG-13 ratings and things. And there was a lot of transition years in there where things that happened in movies and TV back in the 80s or even late 70s would never have, they wouldn't fly today.
So one more thing about Fast Times that we haven't talked about, and I think with all of us being adults at this point in our lives, Mr. Hand, the American history teacher. And he was the American history teacher, and he and Spicoli had this really interesting relationship because Spicoli's always late to class and Mr. Hand hates tardiness. And they really have an interesting dynamic relationship. And when I was a kid watching Fast Times, like, oh, that's the teacher that I hate, Mr. Hand. He's like such a stickler and he's so strict and he demands all these things. And then as we become adults, you look back and you think, that's probably the kind of teacher that I would want for my kids. Mr. Hand, because he wants them to learn. He genuinely wants them to learn about American history, and he's frustrated when they can't figure it out or when they fail tests because he thinks they're smarter than they're at, that they can actually do this work. And the same thing goes for Principal Vernon from The Breakfast Club. Hated Principal Vernon as a kid. As an adult, I'm like, I get it. I understand what he was trying to do, especially with Bender, the criminal who didn't have a father figure in his life. He was trying to do that for him. He was trying to help him understand what direction he was going and where that was going to lead if he didn't, get his proverbial shit together. So Mr. Hand is a great character. And I think you look at him very differently as an adult.
I feel like we just attended a preview of what one of your speeches, your engagements would be if we were to go see them. Everything I learned about pop culture in the 80s. So yeah, we just got a lesson in that.
A little bit.
In moving on, so we've talked about Charlie's Angels, we've talked about Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and of course the next one that seems to make a logical sense, and we're moving more in towards the 90s. We went 70s, 80s, 90s today, is to go and head in towards Baywatch. Baywatch was an icon of the 90s. I think it started technically in the 80s, but it was an icon of the 90s. And, did you watch Baywatch? Was it part of your life at that time?
John?
I mean, I did. It was interesting that it was one of the first syndicated shows that made it big. It didn't live on any one network. And I think that was interesting. But we all watched it, at least us guys. Talk about Jiggle TV. The slow motion run was perfected by Baywatch. I mean, watching Erica Eleniak come running out of the water. I mean, I would drown on a daily basis if she was the one coming in to save me. I mean, I'd be okay with it. But they did. They absolutely perfected this. There was a Friends episode that made fun of it with Yasmin Bleeth. And, Joey and Chandler are just waiting to watch Yasmin run. And they're like, run, Yasmin, run.
And we mimicked that when we were in school. I remember doing that, not as the female portion of it, but we would just sit in a chair and just pretend like we were going really slow at stuff because it was iconic to do that, and David Hasselhoff run, down the beach. Yeah.
You mentioned Friends, and I think it was either the chick or the duck was named Little Yasmin. One of them was, because that was the episode, one of the episodes where Joey had just become Chandler's roommate, and they were getting to know each other. And he was, Chandler walked in, he's like, "What is that on TV? What are you watching?" And he says, "Oh, it's a show about lifeguards." He's like, "Why would you watch a show about lifeguards?" And then, of course,
here,
that was it. Yeah. So I actually did watch Baywatch, probably not as consistently as others may have watched it. I wasn't getting in front of my TV for it because back then, we could record on the VHS, of course, but I wasn't sitting in front of my TV for it, but I was definitely paying attention if it was on. And of course, I still think it's amazing that David Hasselhoff is a German music star.
Like he's everywhere. He's everything. And to John's point, he said about Baywatch, Baywatch was only on network television one season, and it was actually canceled.
Right.
And after that, it went on to become like an international, not just national, but international sensation. And we have to ask ourselves, why did it become an international sensation? Well,
Pamela Anderson. Yeah. Yeah, I think they, I don't know. I mean, I think what was interesting about 90s television is that there were some great ensembles. I mean, there's always been great ensembles in TV, but if we look back just at that particular time with 90210 and then Melrose Place and Baywatch, I mean, these were ensembles when you talk about those shows. And sometimes it's hard to pick out one main character that you say that was the character that drove the show. It was intended to kind of spread it out and maybe not have a main character. And that was another part of what was interesting is you ask people like, who was your favorite character on Baywatch? You're going to get different responses.
So what else is really funny though about Baywatch, to me at least, is if you ever watched David Hasselhoff be interviewed about Baywatch, he took it really seriously. And to this day, when he speaks about it, he will proudly speak of the really just serious topics that they brought up and that they tackled, and, you know, very important things that only Baywatch could talk about. And it's almost, I mean, it's unintentionally funny to see how seriously he took a show that for the most part, those of us watching weren't taking it so seriously.
No, and he himself as a person, you know, people I've seen more memes, I swear, of one man, you know, David Hasselhoff. There were so many David Hasselhoff jokes, but I mean, the man's like you said, he's an international star. I mean, he's Knight Rider. We can't ever argue that he didn't have a place in our hearts, but he also, you know, taking it so seriously, I think may have been maybe made him the butt of the jokes because he did take it so serious.
Well, they have, you know, they did tackle, I mean, they did actually, to their credit, they really put skin cancer out there. And that wasn't something that people were talking about. I know firsthand. I mean, we were, you know, putting everything we could on our skin to get as brown as possible. Meanwhile, it was just burning the hell out of us. And then eventually would peel and turn into a tan, but that's never good. And they brought that to the forefront, actually, in a couple of episodes, if I recall. Like they really tackled that. So he's right in that sense. But, you know, let's be honest. Like, do you guys ever see the movie Eurotrip?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so put it on your list. It came out in like 2004. It flew under the radar, but it's a hilarious kind of coming of age movie with these kids who end up in Europe for the summer before they're going to college. And David Hasselhoff has a part in it. I just put it that way. Like a very funny, like he's making fun of himself part.
Have you seen the SpongeBob SquarePants movie?
Which one?
SpongeBob SquarePants movie?
No.
David Hasselhoff does a huge cameo at the end of that. Very important role as a lifeguard, as the Hoff that comes in and saves the day at the end.
Really?
If you do nothing else out of this, John, you go watch Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Chris, you go watch the ending. I'll spare you the entire SpongeBob movie. Okay.
Thank you.
Go watch the ending of the SpongeBob movie. And yeah, I can remember seeing him come out in that role, and it was hilarious.
I'll try to use that as a pickup line. Hey, do you want to come back and maybe watch the end of SpongeBob SquarePants with me?
Oh, man.
I was told I need to watch it.
It's too easy to make fun of the fact that you're still single.
What's that?
I said you just make it too easy to make fun of the fact that you're still single, if that's your idea of a pickup line. You'll go further. Just come home and watch Beaches. That'll hit.
Listen, if you invite a girl over to watch Beaches and you just one tear, that'll be all it takes, okay? She's yours for good, okay? I promise you, this is a sensitive man. She's yours. Okay, so and we talked about, you know, we're at Charlie's Angels, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Clearly there is, you know, we talked again about that Jiggle TV idea that, you know, at some point Baywatch was criticized, you know, at the same time too, for being a little bit, you know, exploitive of the female and maybe male too. Slow running genre.
There was a very specific male role model that made it onto that show, and I mean, there were a bunch of different male lifeguards as well. I think that was an equal opportunity exploiter of the human anatomy, for sure.
Yeah.
What I will say is I'm thinking your connection is right there in our face. You keep talking about Jiggle TV, but I also know you well enough to know that you love a red herring. So the whole time you're talking, I'm like, it's not that. And I'm desperately trying to like get underneath it and see if there's something deeper. And I'm not getting it yet. But you can say Jiggle TV all you want. I don't think that's it.
No. I'm just gonna tell you right here and right now, that's not it. I know I'm hinting at that, and that's what it is. But yeah, you can keep guessing. I did a lot of work on this one.
To Chris's point, though, I was just thinking in my head how many different actors, because it was an ensemble cast, but the cast changed. It was on television probably, if I had to guess, and I truly have no idea, I would guess it was probably on for at least 8 or 9 seasons, at least.
It was 89 to 2001 for a total of 11 seasons and 241 episodes.
And back then, a season lasted, I mean, today we watch
20
these,
episodes.
20, 22, 24 episodes. They put the work in. Now a season's like 8 episodes on Netflix and the season's over.
Yeah, and you don't see it again for, in the case of, shows like Stranger Things, you don't see it again for 2 to 3 years, by the time you're done. And, to that point, we have to talk about the audience a little bit about who was watching Baywatch, because we over these 241 episodes, what would you think would be the characteristics of the audience? And you said it was an equal opportunity. There were males and females in the ensemble cast. What do you think the percentage of the audience from male to female would have been in watching this show? Like, if you had to guess.
I think it probably skewed heavily male at the beginning, but I'm wondering if that started to come more towards the center as the show went on, because of the different male characters that came on. And to John's point, but I mean, lifeguards, they don't wear like, Amish clothes. I mean, they're wearing, bathing suits because that's what they do. They have to get into the water. So I would say it was probably heavily male and then skewed almost 50-50 by the middle of the season.
I'm going to go the other direction and say I think it's skewed pretty heavily female. I think guys would watch casually, to your point where you said earlier, if it was on, I was watching it, and it didn't live by a normal schedule on my television anyway. Sometimes it'd be on one channel and sometimes it'd be on another. Sometimes it'd be on early or late in syndication. So it wasn't one of those shows that I would sit down and watch every Tuesday at 8 p.m. But I think when I'm thinking of the storylines, they were more soap opera-ish, drama-ish, traditional storylines that I think more women would be apt to watch than men. So I would probably say it would skew 60-40 female.
And John, you would be more correct in that because, according to the data, when the show was at its peak, it was at something like 65% of the audience was female. And I think it had to do a little bit with that drama, but it also had to do with other things as well. I mean, and Chris, you mentioned before about the positiveness of Charlie's Angels, our first segment. You also mentioned on touching on social issues in the second segment with Fast Times at Ridgemont High. But then Baywatch, Baywatch also brought forth some of those, drama things and important social things of the time. And so 65% were female, looking at those, those roles that were in the shows, movies. Yeah.
It's interesting. And I guess John made a good point. I mean, the dramatic storylines, the drama between the characters, which guys tend to not gravitate towards.
Yeah, stereotypically anyway.
We want it a little simpler.
And it's funny, though, because just like I think the characters in Charlie's Angels fought against a little bit of that Jiggle TV, I think they were more apt to embrace it just because of the era. I remember there was a big deal with Pamela Anderson where she wanted to limit the running in slow motion. Like she pushed back significantly on wanting her role to actually progress. She took it seriously. She wanted her role to have more of a senior lifeguard management, saving lives. She took it as seriously as Hasselhoff did and pushed back against that Jiggle TV aspect of it. And I do remember towards the later years that I'd see it on, there was less of that.
Yeah, and it is funny to hear those things coming from, because we talked about that porn thing and the Jiggle TV. Pamela Anderson in, Playboy magazine is one of the most, famous celebrities to have ever graced the covers and the Playmate things in Playboy magazine. And so, and I think she fought against that for a larger part of her career than afterwards. I think she used that in the beginning. That's my personal opinion. Used that in the beginning, got the attention, and lived the rock and roll lifestyle, Tommy Lee, the whole bit, and then later on wanted to, change up her view and her image, to the point where she was just recently in the news for having gone on and to a film festival, no makeup, showing herself exactly as she was, as a beautiful woman of, in her late 50s.
Yes. I mean, although I would question a little bit, because when did her tape get stolen?
Oh yeah, stolen. Yeah.
I don't know, guys. I think it did get stolen. I mean, I've watched a couple things on that, and yeah, from what I understand, there's no need for quotes. I think it went out without her wanting it to go out. Then she did whatever she did afterwards to capitalize on it. But that just speaks to her being a smart businesswoman, in my opinion. If it's going to go out, she's like, I'll be damned if I don't profit from it. But I don't think that it was a leak from her.
Yeah.
Yeah, tremendous respect for the woman. She is more talented, I think, too, than those images had. At that time, I can remember thinking of her as the stereotypical classic blonde bimbo. And that was how, you saw her, until you did start to watch the later episodes of Baywatch, and you did start to see she had abilities, thoughts. Then she started fighting for PETA. I mean, the woman knew what she was doing.
Yeah, she's a big animal activist. So
Mm-hmm.
in my, as far as I'm concerned, she's got a part of my heart on that side of it, for sure, on the animal activism side. No doubt about it.
The last thing I'll say about Baywatch, and I'm just sitting here thinking, is it's one of those shows that, at least for me, somehow found its way into my subconscious or my unconscious. Because I don't remember, as I said, watching serially. Like, I wasn't there every day, but I'm still stuck on just how many people were on the show. And I'm thinking to myself, I know the names like Erica Eleniak and David Charvet and Billy Warlock and Pamela Anderson and Yasmin Bleeth. And I can go on and on and on. And not only are there character names embedded in my brain like CJ, I know the actual actors' names, and I don't know why. It's one of those things where it's almost like through osmosis. I don't remember dates that are crucially important to my children's well-being, and yet I remember that Billy Warlock was on Baywatch. It literally seeped into my brain when I didn't realize that it had.
It was pervasive. It was everywhere. I mean, whether you sat down and watched it or not, I was never a 90210 fan, speaking of ensemble casts. I didn't sit down and watch 90210 or Melrose Place, and yet I could tell you all the characters.
So, but that's what makes pop culture great is, John casually saw Baywatch here and there, but when you have something that's such a pop culture phenomenon like Baywatch, and it's everywhere, even when we didn't have it in front of us consistently with our phones and social media and all of the things now that drive so much of our pop culture and the references that we have, that we could remember, that shows you the power of it and how it really does have a place in our brain, even if we just are casually hearing it, casually seeing it, casually, listening to it, and it finds a place and it stays there and we're able to pull on it. It's pretty cool. And I wonder 20 years from now what Jeopardy is going to look like, because where people used to find a place in their brain for American history and English literature, it's now going to be, we find these things, like John said, I can't remember important dates for my kids' welfare, but I can remember these ridiculous pop culture things, and I'm the same way. So
I think it was water cooler talk. I think we all sat around, and I think it points also to our phones and the ease of access of information. We did water cooler talk at that time. Everybody got together and spoke about these things. So even if you weren't able to contribute to the conversation, and what's funny here is, like, John's able to contribute to our Fast Times at Ridgemont High conversation, having not been a part of that movie and having never seen it, and yet because he spoke about it or saw a few things about it, he was able to contribute, and we pick up those things. And I wonder 20 years from now if we're going to be able to pick up on those connections because we don't do the water cooler talk as much anymore. This is our water cooler right now.
Well, I mean, John saw one scene from Fast Times 150 times, but
It counts.
it counts, yeah.
I saw the Ditto scene.
So,
Okay, so with that being said, talking around the water cooler and the future, and the whole idea of our podcast here is we have to connect these three things. So we've talked about Charlie's Angels, we've talked about Fast Times at Ridgemont High, we've talked about Baywatch, and I imagine that the two of you right now are trying to, and our viewers or listeners are trying to rack their brains and probably have a general good idea of what they think the connection is that's in my mind about these three items. And so I will tell you, I'm going to hear from both of you first, but then I'm going to tell you a little something, and there's going to be a little twist to this, right? There's a twist. So, okay. So, gentlemen, I want to hear what your thoughts are about the connection between these three.
I got nothing. I mean, aside from the obvious, I've got nothing.
yeah.
Okay, well, tell me your obvious, John, besides the Jiggle TV.
That's it. I mean, it's the fact that all three of these shows, the two shows in the movie, were exploitative in some ways, whether it's the pool scene, whether it's Jacqueline Smith in the showers in the prison, whether it's the MTV style montages of Baywatch as they're going down the beach in the bathing suits. That's the only connection I'm able to, maybe my brain is wired to focus on that, but that's what I got.
Male wiring.
I can only think of two things. One is that they all spawned iconic posters. And the second one would be a little deeper, which would be that they all three of them did tackle important social issues of the day and of the time. And they did it through a little bit of a different lens rather than having it in a book, or having the news tell us or the media. It was actually, they were telling us through entertainment, but they were making points that needed to be made.
And both of you, surprisingly, there are actually, the name of our podcast, the ThreeViewMirror, there are actually three separate connections between these three things that we'll talk about. And Chris, you basically said the first one, which was iconic women and posters that came out of this because of Pam Anderson and her Playboy things. Farrah Fawcett was also on the cover of Playboy. Farrah Fawcett's poster, Cheryl Ladd's poster, Phoebe Cates, so definitely you kind of rung the bell on that one, which what these were, I guess what I would term the first connection would have been boys' dreams, at that particular age. And especially our listeners that are listening to this were probably of that age when these three shows at one point were literally their Japanese, turning Japanese moments. Okay. So connection number one is slightly obvious. Connection two, Chris, you kind of pointed to it, and I almost could, I see your point just as well. Connection number two is where we take a look at these three shows, and I kept mentioning the Jiggle TV. So you're both kind of right there in that the shows starting from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s to Baywatch were taking a beat. They were highly criticized, the women of, not the women, they weren't criticized, but there were some people that had, that knew that Charlie's Angels was a little bit more about the jiggle than it was about the issues. And so what we saw a lot was a growth. Can you see a growth between these three things related to what you said, Chris, but heading in a growth segment? And I mentioned the 65% of women loving Baywatch. Do you see any connection there?
I mean, you say growth, so the only thing I can think of is that the female characters continue to get more empowered, maybe. Although in Fast Times they were high school students, so it was kind of like, But I mean, I can see weaving that through that, that female characters have gotten more empowered over, each decade, more and more and more.
Yeah,
I would have to skip over Fast Times because I couldn't make a connection there necessarily.
Stacy and Linda in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, they were the women who were in charge of their sexuality at that point. They were they weren't people telling them to run on TV or to, Charlie wasn't telling them, go do this as an assignment. They were the ones empowered to do it themselves, were they not? They went out and taught they were empowered to go out and name their sexuality and name what they wanted for themselves. It wasn't the boys running the show at that point. Get it?
Yeah.
Heading on to Baywatch, the reason 65% of women loved Baywatch so much was because those women were heroes. Now they went from, not just choosing their point in life or their plot or their whatever it was, and making decisions for themselves. They were the actual heroes. So we see a progression in the television, the sort of cinematic view of TV, where women went from being sort of objects all the way to being the hero of a particular, movie or TV show.
I can see that. I mean, for the time that I watched Baywatch, and obviously, they were lifeguards. And so regardless of whether they were running in slow motion at the beginning of the show, the reality is when somebody was drowning, when somebody had been bitten by something, when something was going on, who was going to jump in and save them?
Mm-hmm. It was a reduction in misogyny decade by decade in a lot of ways.
Can't really speak to Fast Times because I don't know who either of those. I mean, I know Phoebe Cates only in one way. I have no idea who Linda is. But in terms of Baywatch, by the time I didn't even know names. By the time Baywatch ended, I think Hasselhoff was gone. So by the end of it, the women that were the window dressing in the show became actually not only heroes, but the leaders, the boss, the people in charge of everything.
Got the nail on the head right there, John.
That happens.
Okay, so when I mentioned 3 connections, we have Every Boy's Dream, the beautiful women featured in these things. Then we have the empowerment of women, but there's a much simpler connection between the 3 things, and I want you to put it in your mind. And John, you can speak to this one. We have Farrah Fawcett. When I asked you, I said the first thing you think of is Farrah Fawcett, and you mentioned, okay, so there's Farrah Fawcett, there's Phoebe Cates, and there's Pamela Anderson. There's a very simple connection, the last one, between the 3 of them. I'm stumping you.
Yeah, I got nothing.
Were they all on the cover of a particular magazine?
No. No. I'll ask. Picture it in your mind. Picture it in your mind.
Many times.
Ready for a grand reveal, and it was the simplest connection. The one that started this for me was going to be my only connection until I found some more connections, is the red bathing suit.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, Farrah Fawcett's post the red bathing suit. Yeah,
it is the It is that the connection that began all of this for me when I started putting this together was we're talking about infamous red bathing suit scenes.
Totally.
And the first one, Phoebe Cates coming out of that pool. Second one, Farrah Fawcett and her red world famous poster. And number 3, all of everybody in their red lifeguard swimsuits in Baywatch.
Wow.
I would not have gotten it.
I wouldn't either. And that's so interesting. I wonder if that's coincidence or if that was just.
I think it's the color red.
And why the color red? Like what would be.
I think it has certain connotations. I think it has certain subliminal messages behind it. If, she came out in a baby blue bathing suit, it's just not the same thing.
Yeah, if it wasn't white and see-through, Bo Derek style or something, then it's
gotta be red.
Red, which is iconic as a sexual color. I mean, it's a boudoir color. And so, it is supposed to excite. And, I think there's a reason that they chose all 3. I can't find that reason, but I think we can all imagine.
Without a
Yeah,
doubt.
that's really good. Yeah, that's really good. I know. I mean, I see all three of them now, and I was trying to figure out, like in my head, like what connects.
Yeah,
the
the
three
thing
of
that was
them
stumping me
visually.
is, visually, in my mind, they'd always been wearing considerably less.
Skin tone.
Exactly.
Well, John, you aced. Whether you think you did or not, you win point number 1. Chris wins point number 2, and I win point number 3.
Yeah,
Okay,
there you go.
we're all winners at the end of this particular podcast. Okay, for all of you wonderful listeners out there, we thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed connecting these 3 seemingly random items. And if you love this podcast, we're available on Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram as the THREE View Mirror podcast. Join our community and get notified of new episodes every week. And speaking of communities, we want to give another big shout out and thank you to our amazing sponsor, Do You Remember? The place for sharing collective memories. Join their community as well of millions of followers sharing collective experiences across multiple social media channels. And if you like this podcast, also remember that you may contact us to sponsor 1, 2, or 3 or all of the segments here on our wonderful show. And so, gentlemen, just wrapping it up, any final thoughts from either of you?
Yeah, I actually thought it was awesome, and I now looking back, the red bathing suits, of course, the other 2 connections as well, but for me, really, like those 3 iconic red bathing suits, that was absolutely perfect. And I can mark the time for me by bathing suits and bikinis, I'm sure, if I had to. So yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, for me, I'd have to say the same thing. I mean, I can see all 3 of these iconic women in their settings with the bathing suits. But more importantly, it's to the point of the progression that you mentioned and seeing the evolution of from jiggle to little less jiggle.
Hero. I want to say, well, hero, actual true portrayals of female heroes that became more of the a point of the shows or movies.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't forget that we did have female heroes in the 80s like Sarah Connor, who was not wearing a red bathing suit in Terminator. So they were there, but they actually, to your point, obviously much more prevalent in 2023, and certainly can thank the evolution from Charlie's Angels to Fast Times to ultimately Baywatch. So well done. Very well done.
All right, gentlemen, I thank you. You were wonderful. Next week, we are handing this off to genxjono to come up with our 3 topics, and we look forward to that. So until next time, this is the ThreeViewMirror podcast. Tuning out.
See ya.
Are we really looking forward to that, John? I don't know.
We'll see.
Stay rad, everybody.
Yeah.